All right, golf junkies. If there was a modern day Mount Rushmore for golf instructors, this guy, Jim McLean, would be on there. And I'm thrilled to have him back. Jim, it's great to hear from you. It's even better to see you. How are you?
Well, Mark, I'm fine, and it's good to be on with you. I'm looking forward to our talk today.
Yeah, me too. I've been looking very forward to it. In fact, correlating your and my schedules was like an act of Congress. So tell the fans what you've been up to of late.
Well, of course, I teach down here in Miami. We're at the Biltmore Hotel and also over at the Miami Beach Golf Club on
Mhm.
South Beach. So two places down here in Miami. I just got back from a trip in New York. I did two schools at Westchester Country Club,
Right.
actually where I first started teaching, and also out at Friar's Head. I did a little teaching out there before getting back this weekend.
And one of my rare weeks off from broadcast with CBS, I was lying on a beach listening to the US Open coverage on Sirius XM, and lo and behold, there's Jim McLean there too. So you're not slowing down.
Well, I do the major championships here in America for
Mhm.
Sirius XM. I've done that for the last 4 or 5 years. I had a show on for 6 years, the
Right.
golf school, but yeah, still a little bit with Sirius XM. I call in occasionally with my friend Jeff Warren for golf school, and those are a lot of fun too.
Yeah, they certainly are. Okay, let's dive into it. I instead of having you tell folks who hadn't not familiar with you who you are, I just figure we'd kind of go through the list of legends, and I use that term lightly because you're yourself one of legends that you've spent time with, learned from, worked alongside. So if you're cool with that, I'll kick it off with, you send me a list, and I was like, my goodness, legend, 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 legend. So why don't we start with the golf machine, gentlemen? In Homer Kelly and Ben Doyle. Talk about the time, something you learned from them, please.
Okay, I'll go back a little bit after that afterwards, but as I started to really get into teaching, I actually started working with Ben Doyle at the second tour school I went to, and Ben was down in California, Carmel Valley Ranch.
All right.
So he was from Seattle, Washington, where I'm from, and that's where the golf machine started. And it was a bit of a cult following in the Northwest, and it moved down to California. And then, a lot of people still use the golf machine. They use a lot of the verbiage from the golf machine even to this day, even though it's 55 years old or so.
Mhm.
But um, yeah, Ben was a very articulate. He's the guy that brought the golf machine to the world because, Homer Kelly was a technician, not a good player himself, but Ben was a good player. And I played with Ben before in the Northwest. And he pretty much I think, well, he memorized the book, which was a very, as you know, Mark, a very
Ability.
complicated book and very difficult.
Uh-huh.
Um, my dad was an engineer for Boeing, so he could understand things. But when I was working with Ben, we went through a lot of detail, a lot of ideas from the book. Not that I didn't memorize the book or know that much about the book, other than taking lessons from Ben and watching him teach. A young Bobby Clampett was there. We practiced a lot together, actually, and Bobby ended up being the #1 amateur in the country and a very good tour player. So, Ben was very different from the other teachers. I came from the playing side. I'll talk about some of my other teachers,
Yeah.
but he came from the theoretical side. So, some of us teachers are more playing oriented. I think more are more theoretical. So it was fascinating, and I love the idea of the positions.
Mhm.
I got to, familiar with the book then as far as the different positions that Homer Kelly used, pre-impact positions, and a lot of other lag ideas. Their ideas, diverged later from what I would learn to do myself, but I worked a lot on, keeping my head absolutely steady and getting a lot of lag in my swing, which, I think all students are responsible for their own game, and teachers do the best they can to help you, but
Mhm.
we have to do our own due diligence and find out what works. But I think I overdid some things right there for myself. But later on, I was able to go to see Homer Kelly in Seattle at his house.
Yeah.
It's about 1977. It was years later by then I was teaching in New York at Westchester Country Club. And, I spent about 5 hours with Homer in his garage. You sign a little book, when you come in, and Joe Daniels still has that book. He bought the rights to the golf machine. So you can see who really went there, really talked to Homer. And he had, planes and flails and all kinds of things in his garage. And it was very fascinating to talk to him and really get into the weeds of how he broke down a golf swing, how he looked at a swing. Homer was not a good golfer himself, but he certainly did this incredible work on what he thought happened in a golf swing.
I just want you to help folks now because they hear you and they're like, well, Jim said it, I must check it out. For the folks that have not read The Golf Machine, I made the mistake the first time I attempted it to kind of go chronologically by chapter. Then I get to talk to Lynn Blake many moons later, and he goes, no, you shouldn't be doing that. So help the folks. Oh my goodness, because it's fascinating and it's all encompassing, and you can get yourself certainly misdirected if you don't read it properly. So please advise people, Jim.
Yeah, well, the way he wrote the book is you didn't go front to back, like you said. There was areas that you would go to and then refer back to, and it was written like an engineering type manual on a textbook on how to figure out what's happening in golf, how to find what you should be doing. But it turns out that there's, an unbelievable amount of ways to swing the club, even in the golf machine. Although the teachers that taught the golf machine when I was young, all pretty much taught the way Ben did. It was a certain way of teaching, and much more. There's two main ways of swinging, the hitter and the swinger.
Yeah.
And almost everybody taught the swinger idea, which was a lot of lag in the swing and the bowed left wrist. So it was pretty much taught one way, but really in the book, there's two main ways of swinging the golf club, one with the right arm and one with the left arm being the swinger and the right arm being the hitter.
You know what? My admiration for you, as in back then an aspirant instructor, now grizzled enough to be able to have an opinion, was that you always brought a real playing element to golf lessons. And I don't think people realize what a good player you were in your own right. Collegian, played in major championships. I want you to comment on that, because you said earlier about, where the game is now and where instruction's going. But I almost find that sometimes people are becoming too focused on swings and not focused on the playing of it enough. And so we're seeing people tie themselves in knots in an effort to swing better, just to score better, but nothing could be further from the truth. Am I making sense in my question slash observation?
Yeah, well, when we talk about instruction, we generally go to the golf swing, hitting the golf ball, and there's definitely geometry and physics to a golf swing and all the modern things that we're able to bring to the golf instruction now. But the centerpiece of my golf schools is I call it the 25% theory, which would be the long game, the short game, the mental game, and the management game. And I really got that idea from my own playing and why I didn't play the tour, full time, where I was weak. A lot of things I didn't want to admit to myself on, the nerves and the mental aspects of the game. Also, my management skills probably very lacking as far as doing a lot of things I shouldn't have been doing when I was a young guy. But putting that all together, it's one thing to hit the ball really good and even have a really good short game, but you still got to make that walk from the first tee to the first tee, and being able to control yourself and the ability to let go in golf, like you have done, you and your brother, of course,
Yeah.
especially your brother winning a Masters, the ability to let go and to play at your maximum level, like you're playing by yourself at night, is a tremendous skill. And I found that I was pretty small when I got into tour events. I took up a lot of space in college. I took up a lot of space when I played amateur golf. I won a lot of tournaments as a young guy, but when I got out to the tee next to Nicholas and Arnold Palmer and Trevino, I took up a very small space,
They do
and I
cast big
definitely
shadows, though. Those are some large personalities there. You talk about the ability to let go. I'm going to jump
yes.
ahead because my mind is going there. One of your mentors, friends, guys you played golf with, passed away sadly last year, I believe it was, unless the time is missed, unless I'm bad on
No,
time.
that
And that's
mhm.
Jackie Burke. And, to me, he's one of the great wise minds, or was in the game. And I'll never forget a lesson he gave to a young Jim McLean, who was at Houston in college at the time, I think it might have been. And you were struggling to hit your driver in play. I'll let you pick up the story from there because
Well,
brilliant.
yeah. Somehow, Jack, I went out to Champions because I one of the guys at Houston was a member out there, and somehow we became friends when I was pretty young.
Mhm.
Anyway, I was going to be playing in the Masters, and I asked him for a tip. I said, Jackie, I'm starting to get nervous, 2 months ahead of this tournament. My driving's not too great. He said, take 3 balls and go down to the Galveston, hit 3 balls into the Gulf of Mexico.
All
And then
right.
he turned around. So I thought, he just blew me off. Uh, and I make a long story short, I ended up being down there with uh, Litsky and Rogers. We were down in Galveston. We used to drive the car on the beach. It's a very hard beach. And I had my clubs in the car, and I just remembered what he'd said a few weeks before. I said, well, I'll hit the balls in there. And I
Mm.
went back to the car, hit the balls in the ocean. Meant nothing to me at all, Mark. Didn't mean anything. I when I next saw him, the next time I was out there, I said, Mr. Burke, I did what you told me. And he said, well, yeah, I know he didn't remember. And I said, what was that? He said, what was that? And I said, well, I hit the 3 balls into the Gulf of Mexico. And he said, oh, great. What'd you learn? And I said, I didn't learn anything. And he said, well, how'd you hit them? I said, well, I hit 3 perfect drives. And he said, well, that's it, you dumb son of a bitch. He said, you got to let go. Just hit in, aim at the ocean. He said, don't aim. He said, let go. And, I've used that my whole life in teaching, because sometimes we talk about aim small, miss small, which is also a good idea. But sometimes, Mark, aiming small, miss small gives you the idea of guiding a little bit,
Uh-huh.
steering. And I've really found that working with the tour players, a lot of the guys I've worked with, the idea of just letting go, ripping it, was been much better than guiding it out there.
It's such a fine line we walk, and everyone watching this can sympathize. Like you ask a person to pick up a, a ball and throw it to someone, they'll do it, or throw the bag into the cornhole hole, or we're even playing darts. I'm from South Africa, lots of darts there. If you try and guide the dart into the board, you're never hitting, but you aim above it and you just let go. Yet at the same time, you got to have the intermediate target, like Jack Nicklaus said. Help us reconcile this whole thing, please, Jim.
Well, it's whatever works for you, but I definitely think that Jack and all the great players really really swung. They weren't guiding the golf ball. And I'd also say with Jackie, he was a genius with the short game. Ben Crenshaw, Jack Nicklaus, and Mickelson give him huge credit for their putting. 3 of the greatest putters of all time. And a lot of that was for them to relax. He tried to get you not on the line, not trying to be parallel. He liked you to be open, and he liked you to hit the ball away from yourself, and he wanted some swing in the putter and not tight. And I think Faxon was a lot like that too. I spent a decade working with Brad, and he was also he got his effort level down really low to putt great. And I think a lot of us, get our tension level up so high, especially in tournament golf. And that's another great lesson from Jackie Burke.
Yeah, I will say so. And, I think about that and I'm listening and sort of reading between the lines. And you've been around legends like Snead and company. And then I hear a Ben Hogan saying the most important shot is the next one. And so that to me, listening to that going, well, yeah, this one that I'm over is important, but it's defined by the next one. And in a way, I guess, that'll help us to let go on the one we're over. You'd agree?
Oh, absolutely. Very tough thing, easy thing to talk about, but
Yeah.
staying in the present moment and not letting a bad shot or maybe even a great stretch of holes get into your brain, and just to keep playing in the present moment, not thinking, especially when we're trying to break barriers, to break 100 or break 90 or break 80. And, with all the club pro golf that I did for 19 years,
Mhm.
all the members that were trying to shoot, under 80, and they would, double bogey 18 or bogey 16, 17. And it's, no matter what our level is, and certainly in professional golf, of being able to carry a lead into the fourth round. I know the people, they've gotten so much better at it, I think, but uh, being able to stay in the moment, not project yourself holding the trophy, which, obviously you and I have probably done a few times.
Yeah. Okay, let's go from Jack Burke to
Mhm.
Claude Harmon. I mean, this
Yeah.
another uh just a doyen of our industry, great player, just like all of you guys were, but a player again who became a master instructor just because of, I think, the simplicity and the wise way he would communicate. What do you learn from him?
Well, Mr. Harmon was a great player. He won the Masters, and he was a brilliant player. All the assistants I know that worked for Mr. Harmon, they never beat him. A lot of great players there. And one of my first teacher, Al Mengert, who played 20 years off and on the tour and had a lot of success out there, he said he never beat him in the 2 years. He was a Walker Cup player for America and a very good player. He said he never beat him one time in 2 years. Claude believed in playing as a club pro, so he played pretty much almost every day with the members. He taught half a day and played. Tommy Armour worked for him, for one great other, genius teacher. But yeah, Mr. Harmon was a great teacher and a great player, which I got a lot from those type of guys that I had the chance to work with. But when I went to Tamarisk as the director of golf down in California, he was right across the street at Morningside. When I went to New York, he had been the pro at Wingfoot for 39 years, and one of the great clubs in America. And he'd helped so many people. He was considered the greatest bunker player that's ever been. And all his boys are tremendous bunker players and teachers.
Mhm.
But he would always teach me, about this left wrist,
Bethlehem
the
Steel.
value of, hitting against a left wrist. He hated a hook.
Yeah.
He was all these guys that maybe we'll end up talking about. One other thing that really got me, Mark, was their reverence for Hogan, because they were tremendous players. Jackie, we've already talked about, and Claude, Mr. Harmon, great players themselves, but they put Hogan,
Yeah.
at a different level. And they loved talking about Hogan and what they learned from watching him and being his best friends.
I would, I'm going to pivot off that, or I'm going to segue from that, because you talked about your 25% approach, which I love. And to me, a large part of the game and playing it well is managing your way around a golf course. And that was something that both Bill and Butch Harmon said to me that their father was a stickler about when he played with Hogan. They never talked golf swing. Hogan would talk more about where to miss the ball, how to flight the ball in conditions. And it was about finding your way around this golf course as opposed to swinging it in a certain way.
No doubt about it. The great players, Nicholas Faldo, Tiger, Rory, um, DeChambeau, all of them. They know it. They know where they can go. Now, of course, they're Bryson and some of these guys are just ripping drivers down there because they figured out that's the best way they can shoot a score. And then they're missing the ball though in the right spots,
Correct.
putting it on the right areas of the green, getting it to the right levels. And we can learn so much by just watching how they play and watching, listening to what they say.
This has just come to me. I want your take out of respect. One dimensionality to ball flight, predictability. Look, it's an unpredictable thing, but as far as possible. You spoke of Bryson, and that makes me think of the US Open, and Scotty Scheffler, who's as reliable as the sunrise from tee through green, struggled there because he said that with the stuff on either side of the fairway at Pinehurst number 2, it didn't give him a side to miss. And I was like, hell yes. So I'd like you to build on that, please, because advise the viewer and the listener where, you might slice the ball, but if you're doing it 9 times out of 10, you got something you can play with.
Yeah, that's definitely a thing that Hogan advocated, and that Jackie always would talk about putting a wall up the left side of the fairway, and that the ball just couldn't go to the left. He would just visualize. He was a great visualizer, and I think that all the great short game people are tremendous visualization people. They can see what's going to happen. They can see where they need to miss the golf shot. They can see where it needs to go. But having a one-way miss is, I think, a tremendous advantage in driving the ball. The fairways at Pinehurst were just like if you and I go down to play, they didn't change anything. The fairways were wide enough, but it was scary, like a bowling alley going down with bad looking misses on the side. Although I think probably at the USGA wish they put some more of that wire grass in, because there was too many times, I think more than 50% that you could get a reasonable shot to go to the green.
Can you imagine with more wire grass, the pace of play? It was already slower.
Yeah, well, you're right.
Okay.
Good point.
Moving along. Ken Venturi. I mean,
yeah.
Goodness me. Please talk about that.
Well, Venturi was a genius player. He was in the military. He didn't start tour golf till he was 25 years old. He had a great 10-year streak of being Rookie of the Year and winning, I think, 14 times on the PGA Tour and winning a US Open. Had 2 super close calls at the Masters where he finished second. Palmer finished with 3-3-3 to beat him one year. And then one year he shot 80 the last round in a hurricane, basically to lose by 1 to Jackie Burke. Scores were super high, so it does sound terrible, but it was really one of those horrible days at Augusta. So he was he lived a big life, but he was taught by Byron Nelson. That was his main mentor. But then he played with Hogan all the time, so he had this great stuff that he taught me about how to play the game, how to manage the game. He was the first guy that really talked to me about the two-way move, about things going away and the lower body starting the downswing. And he talked about that a lot. He taught John Cook since he was a little boy.
Mm-hmm.
I watched him work with Weisskopf and Tom Watson. He worked a lot with both of those great players. Had great ideas. Very intelligent guy, and just so great. I was so lucky. I played probably a few hundred rounds with him, and he shared so many great ideas with me. Just an unbelievable blessing to have the chance to meet him and some of these other guys too.
The thing, I never got to meet him, but I feel like he's a best friend because of anecdotes like that. And I remember sitting with Tom Watson discussing these guys, and Watson learned from Nelson as well. And something that sort of defined all of those guys, because they didn't play in conditions like the current professionals do. Far from. In fact, the fairways that you guys played on were probably, the greens you played on were probably like the fairways of nowadays. And Watson said he was playing against Byron, practice round at Augusta National. And it's 14 fairway and he hits. Nelson hits it down the fairway and they get there and it's all barren in kind of an old divot. And Watson's like, I finally got this guy. And Tom tells me that Byron looks at him, he goes, hey, Watson, watch this. All right. And you can imagine, he digs this ball out this lie up there a few feet, makes birdie. ice sort of wins the match eventually. And to me, when I think of Nelson and Venturi and all these legends, it's the way they played the game and how they found a way to make it happen. It's almost like will, perhaps, one of those immeasurables. So I'd love your commentary.
Well, they were tough guys back then. They grew up in a much tougher time, and they played a lot more golf back then. They played nothing for them to play 36 a day type of stuff. And Byron Nelson's credited with the modern golf swing, and he had that big downward move. And Venturi talked to me a lot about Nelson with the 18 inches at the bottom of the swing, where he wanted the club to, start away on that more straightaway kind of move, and then move down through the ball and hit 4 golf balls in a row. And Nelson had the dip down, which we see a lot of guys do now with a lot of right side bend, and that move down through the ball, which gave him lateral motion and lowering the body, which keeps the club down, closer to the ground, which was, far ahead of his time. So, Nelson was a genius ball striker, up there with Snead and Hogan and of that era when the ball was curving a lot more. Different game, of course.
You recorded them at the time. I'm not sure where the VHS tapes are. I'm dating us.
Yeah.
On the Golf Channel, it was this black soundstage, and there was you, just also very tonal in what you wore, and you'd go through the swings of Hogan and Nelson. I mean, I hung on every word you were talking about. The series you did for Golf Channel was brilliant. And it gets me thinking about the one where you broke down Ben Hogan. Then someone, I'm tying a thread here eventually, stay with me. Someone asked Ben Hogan, so who's the best player in the game right now aside from you? And Hogan goes, that Lee Trevino. And the guy goes, why? And he goes, well, that Mexican has, he goes, aside from me, has the longest flat spot in the game. So now I want you to talk about that, because you also talked about Venturi talking about the length of the base of the arc. How Nelson did it. How all those legends back there who hit the thing off anything squarely all the time, it was the base of the arc that defined them.
Well, Trevino was down in Texas when I was there, and I'm sure you probably saw Trevino. Maybe he's a little bit older, but it was magical to watch Trevino hit the ball and talk to his competitors, where he owned his swing. So I guess there's been the 2 guys that have owned their swing like every week in and week out, was Hogan and Nelson. And Tiger talked about that himself, that he wanted to have a swing that he could own. I guess that never really, obviously he's maybe the greatest player of all time, but he didn't really have a swing that could last, week in, month out, month to month. But Trevino did.
Yeah.
And Trevino was just like a stamping machine. It just it was miraculous to watch him. And when I was at Sleepy Hollow, we had a senior tour event, which Trevino won and played in. And he used to get to the course 2 hours before, and he would go in, have a cigarette and hang out, and then he'd walk out exactly at the same time. And I would just go plant myself behind him and watch him hit balls before the round and then after the round, and watch him play. And of course, he was 50, 51, 52 at this time. But also, when I did CNBC for a couple of years, when they did the senior tour, the Champions Tour, he did the commentary. So I was able to talk to him quite a bit. But watch him hit the ball, Mark, just miraculous. It's just the divots of that long flat divot, where the club just stayed on the ground. The whole bottom of the club stayed on the ground. Just amazing.
It's crazy, isn't it? How it was about function back then. Then for a while, I came up. I was part of the Sony Handycam era. Remember us? You saw us coming.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. I was right there with you.
And then now it's getting back to function over form. So it's weird how golf has sort of gone through this trend. To that, one more, and then I want to talk to you about the X factor in your 8-step swing. Sam Snead. Look, it's a swing that's enviable. All of them are, but sometimes you just have these ones that look fantastic and they are awfully reliable. And Sam Snead had that one. So do talk about what you learned from your time with him.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people would rank Snead as the greatest swing. He was a great athlete and he was tremendous in every sport in West Virginia and great fisherman, great hunter. He did just everything. He was just a miracle man. I thought he was the Babe Ruth of golf. You know, there's just always going to be talked about Snead. I was lucky to I did a DVD with him with the Golf Channel, and I spent 3 days in West Virginia at his house, and we talked about everything. He was older, but he was sharp. You know, he still did the master's dinner, and he was still the master of ceremonies. He got up and told the jokes, and you know, he was just a phenomenally interesting man. So I got to talk to him about all his ideas on golf, what he thought he did, what he worked on. A lot of it wasn't complicated. Um, but you know, it was just great again to spend that time with him and listen to his stories about Hogan and Nelson and Nicholas and Tiger and you know, his thoughts on the game. But of course, his golf swing was just miraculously, just so effortlessly beautiful, and he was the longest hitter of his time.
Would you say, and I'll tee this off with an anecdote. You should say I've got Sam Snead on golf right next door to me over here. And there's another book that in which he wrote he was playing in a pro-am because that's how they made most of their money. And he gets drawn with this guy and he's like, we're going to make some money nowadays. And this guy is missing the ball, cannot play. And Snead says to him, and I paraphrase, what are you trying to do? And he goes, well, I'm trying to take my hands out of the swing, trying to move my body more. And apparently Snead said, well, how on earth are you going to hold the golf club then? You better put your hands back into it. So this guy lets his hands go a bit more, plays well, they win the bet. So basically, I'm wanting to ask you, having spent time around him, having seen the comings and the goings, Jim, does the swing respond to the body or does the body respond to the swing? Because I think there camps on either side of the equation, and I don't feel like anyone's got a true handle on really what's happening.
Well, you put your finger on the two ends of teaching for sure. That the hands and arms teachers were more, I thought when I went to the Golf Digest schools, they were great with the average player. They tee the ball up, feet close together, swing the arms.
Flick and Tusky.
Yeah, Flick and Tusky. And Bob was a really good, and he is still a good friend of mine. And I still talk to Bob. And he was a tremendous teacher. And then you went to the big muscle swing, which was more Jimmy Ballard, I thought, was the guy that really brought that big muscle idea, the dog wags the tail type of thing. And also, though, before that, Venturi and Hogan.
Right.
I don't want to go past that because they really talked about what the body does. So I always like to think the body is going to affect what the arms and the club do, and the hands and the arms are going to affect what the body does. And some people respond to one and some people respond to the other. I do think when you get to be a better player, that the bad golf is played from the elbows down type of thing. And the great players feel passive hands, but that's because they've trained themselves since they were little boys and girls to use their hands, because you obviously, I think, have to train the hands and arms first in teaching.
Maybe this is a bit generic, but for the golfer out there, the club golfer struggling with a slice, I feel like you employ your hands and arms a bit more. For the club golfer struggling with a hook, go the other way around, more body, right?
Exactly. No doubt. Agree completely.
Okay, you've been around Ballard. You learned about research from your time with Carl Welty, another legend. But in the interest of time, you know, we've talked about this before. I want to bring it up again because your point still rings true about the X factor. I've still got the magazine, the Golf Digest, with it on the cover. So talk about the X factor for the folks who don't know, and then talk about now how even with you find golfers now lifting the lead heel again, how you still create the X factor, or at least how golfers do.
Yeah. Well, I wrote 4 pages on the lifting the left heel and the X factor that a lot of people didn't really see. So there's nothing wrong with that. 30% of the PGA Tour lift their left heel right now. So obviously there've been Johnny Miller and Jack Nicklaus and Snead and other people lifted the left heel, and some not too much, but it's still a way to transfer weight and to load up better for a driver for sure. But I got to get back to our point here with the X factor, I guess, is you know, I took hundreds of pages of notes through my time when I first started teaching through the 80s, and I was looking at the angle across your knees and the angle across your hips and then the angle across your shoulders and how those lined up, and they were kind of like a 25% with the knee angle, 50% with the shoulder, the hips, and then 100% with the shoulders. And I always thought, well, the idea of 45 degrees of turn with the hips and 90 with the shoulders is a nice idea, but it didn't ring true to me with I watched the better, top tour players of what were really the numbers. So I'd use a ruler and, do the best I could. And I wrote this article on the 4 turns in the golf swing: the hips, the knees, the hips, the shoulders, and the head, because the head turns in the golf swing and releases.
Yeah.
So I brought that to Golf Magazine, never heard back from. 6 months went by, and I really thought I worked hard on that article. They didn't seem to care about it. I called, actually it was George Pepper, who was the editor. I said, I'm not hearing anything. He said, well, it's too complicated. We're not going to do that. And I said, no, this is really a good thing. People can learn from this. And he said, well, why don't you come down to New York, drive down to New York, and you can talk to our editors here, our instruction editors, and we'll see what we can do. And they ended up saying, long story short again, well, we'll do two because 4 is too much. So we ended up doing the hips and the shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
About that time, I'd done a talk in California, and a teacher out there, Michael McTague, had worked with some people in San Francisco on a gyroscope, and it measured your shoulder turn and your hip turn. And this is in 1991. So I'm pretty
cutting edge with that, huh?
Yeah. So Michael called me. I said, wow, I got this article I'm doing. Does it work? He said, yeah, it works good. I can do your shoulders and your hips. I said, okay, well, bring it out to Doral. I was at Doral then, and we ended up, I showed it to Peter Jacobson, and he loved it. And then, we ended up getting an unbelievable amount of tour players to come. Almost everybody wanted to go and look at it because we had a computer. Nobody had a computer in 1992. Well, this was, and we'd spit out these numbers. So then we put these numbers into the article, which gave it a lot more credence, I think, and was the all-time #1 best-selling magazine for Golf Magazine. That one, and all of a sudden, now when I started speaking, and then I started speaking in other countries, and that was the #1 thing people wanted to talk about was what was going on, the turns and the rotations, and how important it is to hitting the ball further.
Yes, I'm going to say this. Like most people, when I first saw it, I was like, drooling. And so I think I stopped reading half the way through, or maybe I read it and I didn't really comprehend and digest the information, because I was just kind of making it the top of the golf swing. But now you go back to Venturi, who said he likes stuff going in one direction and the other.
Yeah.
The X factor also gets created in transition. So I want to talk about that, and now talk about the proliferation of people trying to turn their chest open through contact right now.
I think that's the most important thing, and I put that on the back cover of the book, of the dot on your belt, how that was moving forward, and that increased the gap or the differential between your shoulders. So let's say your shoulders turn 40 degrees more than your hips. When you start down, you increase that differential because the shoulders are still going back and the hips go forward. And that's something that good players do. That's something that expert players do. And that's something that regular players don't do. They might start down together, or a lot of players start the upper body first on the downswing. So I think that was something that, ended up being called stretching the X, which I think was the probably the most important thing in the X factor.
Okay, let's make it practical for folks. The teacher in me is going to throw a drill at you, and I want the legend in you to respond to aspirant teacher, well, not aspirant, this young teacher guy. Um, I agree with you. Body goes back. Athletes have the low body leading going forward. Venturi said it to you as a young man. I
Hmm.
would say to someone struggling with chest first or whatever, hey, let's put our feet together, step, swing. So step with the lead leg and get the
Yeah.
feeling of the separation. That would be a drill I would advocate. Is there something else Jim McLean would recommend?
Yeah, well, I love drills. I
Yeah,
wrote 2 books on drills. So
I
that's the
love those.
first book I wrote, and they do the step and hit drill is a natural baseball drill. Is a stride and a hit,
Yeah.
a step and a throw action. And I'll say this: when Venturi taught that to me when I was a young guy about arms back and shoulders going through, it was very difficult for me. I really helped me as a teacher because when you're trying to think of going back and starting this down, you get disjointed a lot of times. It gets very uncomfortable. It feels bad. I didn't really at first hit the ball good doing that idea. So you've got to be very careful with that. And I think doing the drills like that drill, the step and hit drill is a really good one. You can also do a stop and go drill where you go up and stop and just get a little bit of where you push down with your legs. And I think one other thing that I'd like to say here that I've been talking about for about 4 or 5 years is kinematic sequence. And I think the knees start first. I think there's 5 parts to kinematic sequence. So I think that push down helps me in teaching where I have people as they go up to the top to use those knees as shock absorbers and push down a little bit before they try to turn their hips. And that gives them a little time to get that move over to the left side where the club, which Venturi talked about, was that great feeling that we've had of time and where the club's hanging up in the air for feels like a long time, but it's just a partial second. But you feel when you're playing great, when you have that timing at the top to change direction,
Mhm.
and that comes from starting the correct way from the ground up.
I would venture further. All the greats I've spent time around with, all of you talk about the value of the transition. The modern day minds, and I use that term loosely, will
Right.
talk more about the club laying down in transition. And I find that's
Mhm.
running as many golfers as what it's fixing. Where you're right, that time, and if the low body leads, it organizes everything else on the way down pretty much anyway.
Yeah, that's an athletic move. So the idea of a natural move is always scares me because natural is what we do all the time. But really, in a natural throwing motion, your wrist is going to work backwards. Anything you do, even chopping a tree down, but anything you do, you're not going to start this way. So a lot of people do that, but that little movement where you can get the lower body to just initiate or to, like I said, maybe get those knees to kick down a little bit, gives you that timing and also gives you the lay down. And that is something that almost all good players do is the shaft will shallow a bit at the top. Some do it quite a bit. Where Nick Price, your friend Nick Price was one of the big lay down guys ever, and one of the greatest ball strikers I've ever seen and also one of the greatest guys who would come down and talk to me at the Doral each year, and because he loved to talk about golf and shared great ideas with me. I never worked with Nick, but just to have the chance to talk to him was fabulous.
I want to say this because I know people will hear you and go and watch for Pricey. He stood the shaft up in his backswing more than most too. So it
Right.
almost exacerbated what it looked like in transition. So now if you're rolling the club behind you going back and you try and do what Nick Price did, you're never going to hit it. Eh?
Correct.
Okay, cool.
Correct. You know what? A guy like Sam Snead would be a great example of a guy that took it inside. Or Bruce Litsky was who I lived with at school, and also a year in pro golf. But they would take it inside and then reverse where the arms and hands went out a lot to start down, but the shaft didn't do it.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
shaft still hung behind them. It just came out on a higher plane, but not on a steeper plane.
Yeah.
So there's definitely obviously different ways to do this. And Scheffler does that. Scotty has a little bit of that little outward move, and also a little Ernie Els and David Toms, KJ Choi, throw at the top.
That
But
little Scotty move makes him a
yeah,
fantastic chipper and pitcher as well.
yeah. So he's kind of is blowing a lot of minds with things that that he's doing in his swing. But the results are the proof's in the pudding. I mean, the guy's just a genius ball striker. Everything.
Right. One more thing. I feel like I'm selling books
Okay.
here. If everyone likes to video their swing, goodness gracious, look at social media, you'll see it. So everyone's got a phone, they can video what they're doing. No one really knows, or very few people know what they're actually looking for. I'm going to advocate to them that they go and find and get the 8-Step Swing by Jim McLean, because to me, it almost lays out beautifully where the club and the body should be throughout these 8 positions or steps that are in the swing. Now, I'm certainly not advocating positional focused sort of stuff. I know you don't, but I feel like it's worthwhile at least to have an idea so you know kind of where to go through en route from the start to the finish.
Well, see, my teachers have a way of looking at video and seeing what's acceptable and what isn't. And I think a key part for the 8-step swing are the safety zones or the parameters, because we know the backswing. Hopefully we know that they're all different. Every guy on the PGA Tour has a different swing. They're not completely homogenized. There's some that are similar, but everything is the length that you take the club, the position of the wrist, everything's a little bit different in the backswing. And then those corridors tighten up until you get to the halfway down to knee height or hip height on the downswing to hip height on the way through it. And then you've got to be good there, Mark. There's just no way. That's the geometry of the swing. And different guys like Trevino out and with the big loop in, and Litsky and Raymond Floyd in and down, but they all hit that back corner of the swing to the front corner of the swing. There's no way around that. I mean, if you're not good there, then you're either going to be too far inside out or too far outside in. But there's a lot of ways to take that golf club away. I think it's more how you position your body though in your backswing, that if you got to be good and getting loaded up good and getting in good shape where you can reverse direction.
Jim McLean, you're a legend. I'm thankful that you would reach out. I'm honored that you would come on my show again. For the folks who are looking now to connect with you or get the books or whatever, please share a web address, places that they can contact you, social media even.
Yeah, well, it's just jimmclean.com, and then McLean Golf is what we do. And I think I might do a little bit more. We have Instagram, and I've got a little YouTube. Well, actually, quite a few things on YouTube, but I appreciate it, Mike. You do a great job, and you're a super nice guy. I like kicking things around here with you, and you've been in golf your whole life.
You know what, Jim? Thank you for saying that. It's meaningful that you would, because as a young kid from South Africa, I learned everything I knew from books, and books by guys like yourself, and all the way back to Percy Boomer and Ernest Jones and company. And so now to get to talk to you with this, I just want to turn around the favor to everyone else who's sitting on the other side of the world going, man, I wish I could hear from Jim McLean. So thank you for saying that. And I'm glad that you would join me to allow people around the globe to get in touch with you and learn from people like yourself.
It's been a pleasure, Mark.